As we enter 2026, we live in a world that is more connected and more distracting than at any point in human history. Information flows endlessly, opinions are abundant, and society constantly tells us who we should be. But if we take a step back and look at the arc of human history, one truth becomes clear: progress, fulfillment, and meaning do not come from following the crowd. They come from understanding ourselves. As we step into 2026, we find ourselves immersed in a world that is at once more interconnected and more fragmented than any previous era. For tens of thousands of years, humans have lived in relatively small communities, their lives largely defined by immediate concerns: survival, reproduction, and the small social structures that bound them together. Decisions were often made for them by circumstance rather than choice, and the external world imposed its pressures in ways that left little room for introspection. But today, these pressures are of an entirely different nature. The abundance of information, the sheer velocity of technological change, the incessant hum of social media and global events, all of these converge to create an environment that is not only distracting, but, in many ways, overwhelming. The mind is pulled in countless directions simultaneously, and the ability to focus on oneself has become not merely difficult, but revolutionary. To focus on oneself in 2026 is to resist a tide that seeks to erode individuality. For much of human history, identity was not a personal project. It was prescribed by the circumstances of birth, by the religion, culture, or nation into which one was born. Individuality was often subordinated to collective needs, and yet within those constraints, humans still sought meaning, still found ways to reflect upon their desires and fears, to measure their place within the unfolding story of humanity. The very act of reflection was considered a luxury in many epochs, reserved for those few who had the time, resources, or inclination to step back and examine their own consciousness. But now, in an age where the external world offers an endless stream of data and narratives, reflection is no longer a luxury, it is a necessity. To ignore oneself amidst the noise is to allow identity to be dictated entirely by external forces, by the narratives of others, by the algorithms that determine which news reaches our eyes and which opinions reach our ears. The first challenge in turning one's attention inward is to understand the nature of these external forces. Our modern technologies are astonishingly sophisticated, yet they are also incredibly invasive in ways that are almost invisible. Algorithms do not simply respond to our interests. They shape them. They predict our desires before we are fully aware of them, nudging our attention toward what is profitable for the platforms that control them. Social media does not merely connect, it amplifies the most emotionally engaging content, regardless of its veracity, creating echo chambers that reinforce existing beliefs and anxieties. In such an environment, the mind can no longer be taken at its face value. It is constantly being sculpted by stimuli that are external and often inimical to our authentic selves. Focusing on oneself, therefore, begins with awareness. Understanding that much of what we perceive as spontaneous thought is in fact influenced, guided, and in some cases manipulated by forces beyond our conscious control. To reclaim the interior world is to reclaim agency over the mind itself. Once this awareness is achieved, the task of self-focus transforms into a disciplined practice of observation. Historically, humans have often looked outward to define themselves, using social comparison as a means of establishing status, purpose, and identity. Kings and priests, merchants and warriors, each sought validation through the eyes of others, and for millennia, external approval was intertwined with survival. But the modern world exaggerates this tendency exponentially. Online, one's perceived value is quantified in likes, shares, and follows. Social validation is immediate, relentless, and often hollow. To focus on oneself is to resist the compulsion to seek external validation, to find instead a metric of worth that is internal, stable, and independent of the shifting tides of public opinion. This requires a subtle but profound transformation, learning to observe one's own reactions, desires, and fears without judgment, and learning to distinguish between impulses generated by authentic self-interest and those generated by external pressures. It is a practice of seeing one's mind as a landscape to explore, rather than a battlefield in which one is perpetually fighting the influence of others. Focusing on oneself also entails a confrontation with time. In past centuries, the perception of time was bound to natural rhythms: day and night, seasons, agricultural cycles, the lifespan of a generation. Modern humans experience time differently. It is compressed, accelerated, and fractured by technological and social forces. We measure our lives not only in years, but in the speed with which information passes before us. The future is often anticipated with anxiety, the past consumed with regret, and the present is fleeting. To focus on oneself is to reclaim temporal sovereignty, to invest attention in processes that nurture growth, insight, and clarity, rather than being swept along by the currents of immediacy. It is to recognize that while external events may be unpredictable, the cultivation of one's own mind, body, and spirit is the only reliable domain in which humans can exercise control and enact meaningful change. This recognition is not merely philosophical, it has practical implications, for it transforms how one allocates attention, energy, and intention in daily life. A further dimension of focusing on oneself involves understanding the narrative structures that govern human thought. For as long as humans have existed, we have made sense of the world through stories. These narratives allow us to link past, present, and future, to impose coherence on chaos, and to construct identities that provide meaning and direction. Yet in contemporary life, the stories we inherit are often fragmented, contradictory, and saturated with external imperatives. Mass media, advertising, and popular culture provide narratives that are seductive, but rarely aligned with one's authentic self. To focus inward is to examine these narratives critically, to identify which scripts have been adopted unconsciously, and to actively choose the narratives that guide our own development. It is the practice of self-authorship, of becoming the primary storyteller of one's own life, rather than a passive consumer of narratives dictated by others. History teaches us that focusing on oneself is neither new nor trivial. Philosophers, mystics, and scientists alike have emphasized the necessity of self-knowledge. Socrates famously declared that the unexamined life is not worth living, and this principle resonates across centuries and cultures. Yet the contemporary challenge is qualitatively different. The speed, complexity, and reach of modern life are unprecedented. Our capacity for distraction is magnified by technologies that were unimaginable to earlier generations. The sheer multiplicity of potential identities, lifestyles, and experiences available today is staggering, but it is precisely this abundance that makes focusing on oneself so critical. Without deliberate attention, one can drift into a life that is reactive, externally defined, and fragmented, rather than intentional, authentic, and coherent. In 2026, the act of turning inward is not merely a personal choice, it is a strategic imperative for anyone seeking to navigate the complexity of the modern world with clarity and purpose. Moreover, focusing on oneself involves recognizing the profound interconnection between mind, body, and environment. Historically, human life was tightly coupled with physical labor, natural cycles, and immediate social structures. Modern existence has decoupled many of these elements. Work can be performed in virtual spaces, social interaction can occur through screens, and physical effort can be minimized by machines. This decoupling offers freedom, but also presents risks. neglecting the body, ignoring emotional states, or failing to attend to the environment in which one lives can undermine the pursuit of self-focus. True attention to oneself requires a holistic perspective, cultivating the body through movement and nutrition, cultivating the mind through reflection and learning, and cultivating the environment to support rather than distract from deliberate growth. It is a practice that is both ancient and novel, combining the wisdom of embodied living with the cognitive tools of contemporary life. Central to this practice is the cultivation of attention itself. Attention is the currency of the mind, the medium through which all experiences, thoughts, and insights are processed. In 2026, attention is under siege. Notifications, alerts, news cycles, and the constant chatter of social media fragment it relentlessly. To focus on oneself is to engage in the deliberate cultivation of attention, training it to remain present with the self, to follow the threads of thought without being derailed by external stimuli. This is not a simple skill. It is an ongoing discipline. Meditation, journaling, reflective walks, and periods of deliberate solitude are all practices that support this cultivation, enabling the individual to observe patterns in thought and emotion, to understand motivations, and to develop the capacity for intentional action rather than reactive drift. The consequences of neglecting self-focus are not merely internal. When individuals allow their identities, goals, and attention to be defined externally, their actions become reactive, their lives increasingly shaped by others' agendas. Societies in which large numbers of individuals fail to focus inward often exhibit collective anxiety, distraction, and fragmentation. Conversely, when individuals cultivate clarity about their own desires, limitations, and capacities, they are better equipped to engage with the world consciously and responsibly. Focusing on oneself is thus both a personal and social strategy. It enhances resilience, creativity, and ethical discernment, while also contributing to the emergence of communities in which members act with awareness rather than compulsion. In practical terms, focusing on oneself in 2026 requires creating spaces, both physical and mental, that are insulated from distraction. Historically, humans created rituals, sacred spaces, and routines to cultivate reflection. Monasteries, academies, and philosophical schools served as structures that facilitated deep engagement with the self. In the modern era, similar structures must be consciously constructed, often within environments designed primarily for distraction. This may involve establishing routines for uninterrupted thought, designing living spaces that minimize sensory overload, or engaging in practices that promote sustained attention. Such measures are not indulgent. They are strategic investments in one's capacity to navigate the complexities of contemporary life with intentionality and integrity. This is Keynote 1, expanded in the requested style and length. It stops without a concluding sentence as you requested. If you want, I can continue the rest of the expansion to fully reach 3,200 words. This version is around 1,800 to 2,000 words so far, while maintaining the same analytical, reflective style. Focusing on oneself is not an act of isolation. It is, paradoxically, the most socially significant decision a person can make in a time of accelerating complexity. Throughout human history, societies have often demanded conformity, suppressing individual reflection in favor of collective obedience. From the tribal norms of prehistory to the rigid hierarchies of monarchies and empires, external pressures have always shaped human behavior. Yet the act of turning inward, of understanding one's own motivations, fears, and potential has consistently been the engine of progress. Individuals who cultivate clarity about themselves are better able to navigate moral dilemmas, make deliberate choices, and contribute meaningfully to the world around them. In 2026, the stakes of this inward focus are higher than ever. The world has become a network of unprecedented interdependence. Yet, the noise, distraction, and misinformation that accompany this network threaten to erode the capacity for intentional action. By concentrating on self-awareness, one can transform what might appear as a fragmented, overwhelming environment into a field of opportunity for growth, insight, and contribution. The cultivation of personal growth begins with the recognition that one's own mind is not a single unified entity, but a complex system of impulses, memories, biases, and aspirations. Modern neuroscience reveals the staggering complexity of the human brain, showing that our perceptions of reality are constructed from a combination of sensory input, prior experiences, and unconscious processes. To focus on oneself is to engage with this complexity intentionally. It requires not only acknowledging the presence of habits, fears, and automatic reactions, but also developing strategies to observe and, where necessary, reshape them. Techniques such as mindfulness, reflective journaling, and deliberate practice become essential tools for navigating one's inner landscape. Each moment of attention invested in self-observation is an investment in the ability to act with purpose, rather than react unconsciously to stimuli imposed by the external world. Personal growth also demands the cultivation of resilience. History demonstrates that the capacity to endure adversity, to recover from failure, and to adapt to changing circumstances is not distributed evenly across populations. Yet the deliberate focus on oneself creates conditions under which resilience can flourish. By understanding personal strengths and limitations, by mapping the patterns of one's own thoughts and emotions, one can anticipate points of vulnerability and develop strategies to mitigate them. In an era defined by rapid technological, social, and environmental change, this form of self-directed resilience becomes not merely an advantage, but a necessity. Individuals who lack self-focus are more susceptible to manipulation, more easily swept into collective panic, and less capable of sustaining meaningful projects over time. Conversely, those who invest in self-awareness cultivate the mental and emotional elasticity required to navigate uncertainty with composure and clarity. Equally important is the development of ethical discernment. In every era, individuals face choices that affect not only themselves but the broader society. Modern life amplifies both the scale and complexity of these choices.